I do hope that we are streaming now. A moment ago, we were not able to connect to Facebook. So hopefully that is happening now. And I'm stalling a little bit so that we're getting it from the beginning. Oh boy. And now what? Now we're not going to be on the YouTube side. This is too much technical difficulty. Okay. Looks like we're live on Facebook at least. Wonderful. Okay. And now that I've stalled, it's been brought to my attention that often it doesn't engage the live stream until after I've rung the bell. So here we go. Okay. And hopefully it's going to appear on the YouTube side as well. I'm quite afraid that it's not appearing over there. Ah, yes it is. Okay, we seem to be streaming in both places. Baruch Hashem. All right, who's with us? Jan is Beanstalk in the house. James Roth. Stephen Giger. Joyce Noach says good Shabbos. Kor Stam says, what is it? Shalom from Kampen in the Netherlands. Welcome, Kor. Tom Beck says it's a beautiful afternoon here in Philadelphia. Yehudit Sobel is in the house from Florence, South Carolina. We wish Nina and Sal and everyone a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Amen. Okay, now that we're finally together, too many technical problems today. I guess it makes sense. There's just a lot of voices, screaming for our attention these days. Still, thank God the lockdown is easing up a little bit. Hopefully, please God, it should be safe, but people are getting out. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of activity online. We had a little bit of trouble connecting our live stream to Facebook and YouTube today, but it seems to be working now. Bill Eldridge says shalom from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and Billy Foster is joining us from Texas. Welcome, everybody. A guten Erev Shabbos. It's still Erev Shabbos. Shabbos begins tonight. I can't wait. Last week we had our first Kabbalah Shabbos minyan in a backyard, a small group of people, physically distanced. And I must say, I received an article from my brother, who's a cardiologist in Boston. I should post the link. It was an interview on a health-related website, I think called Blue Notes or something like that. And I think that the website is often focused on nutritional eating, but the interview was with a very high-level epidemiologist. I hope I'm saying that right. A former interim director of the CDC, somebody who predicted what this pandemic would be like, and a very reasonable and balanced voice taking sort of everything into account, avoiding the politicization around the plague and its lockdown, and really just focusing on best practices and the fact that, of course, we can't stay in lockdown forever, and of course, we can't come out of lockdown willy-nilly. But something that was interesting that the doctor who was being interviewed said is he doesn't believe in social distancing. He believes in physical distancing. He said, I pray that, he didn't say I pray, but he said, I hope that we will never become socially distanced. I think he's right. The term it ought to be physical distancing. We need to keep that space between us because it increases the amount of time and decreases the amount of time that it takes, and it decreases the amount of exposure received between people, and the fact that droplets of liquid could go from one person's respiratory tract to another. So he says, of course, we have to have physical distancing, and there's going to be different parameters for the physical distancing if one is indoors, if one is outdoors, if a person is sick, if their face is covered, if it's not covered, etc. He says, but we must remain members of a community. And so if we want to speak to each other by the telephone or online or from a porch to the street, we're going to do the things that are necessary to maintain a safe physical distance, but we should not at all, have a social distance between us. If anything, what we need now is social nearness. Obviously, he's just talking about terminology, but I think it's really worth hearing from somebody in the scientific community the importance of social relations. What we need is physical distance to protect people's health, but social nearness also helps foster the mental health, the mental well-being, the emotional well-being of a community, and that is important. All right, let's get into it. Let us get into it. Okay, where are we holding? We are on page 98, Daf Tzadi Ches. We're in chapter 10 of Masechet Shabbos, Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 10, and today we'll wrap up our discussion of Mishnah number 1 of chapter 10. We're going to come to a beautiful discussion today about the women who built the tabernacle and how they were inspired by wise-heartedness and hearts that inspire wisdom. And there's a difference between being wise-hearted and having your heart inspire you with wisdom. And we're going to talk about that difference and these wonderful women who built the tabernacle. So let's wrap up our discussion first. Here in this first Mishnah of chapter 10, we've been talking about the prohibition not only on carrying objects from one domain to another, but also carrying more than 4 cubits within the public domain, and how that prohibition extends to throwing objects, and then the related action of passing an object from one person to another. So one little point, we talked quite a bit about if you throw an object from a private domain to another private domain and it passes over the airspace of a public domain. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today, but first let's just cover this short idea that if you throw something from a public domain to another public domain, why are the two public domains not the same domain? Because there's a private domain in between them. So the rule here is if you throw this object more than 4 cubits, so what would that mean? So it's going to go from one domain to another. It's going to go more than 4 cubits. If you do that, then you're liable for violating Shabbos. It doesn't matter that there was a private domain in between them. So if the private domain was narrow and you were able to make a throw from one public domain to another public domain, and the object still didn't travel the minimum measure for liability of this, which is 4 cubits, so then it doesn't matter that it went through a private domain on its way. All that matters is that total distance. And from this we learn that public domains join with each other to sort of be considered as one domain, even if there's something separating them, and that the object which passed through the airspace over the private domain is not considered to have come to rest in the private domain just by virtue of passing through its airspace. All right, now let's go back to this odd exception that we learned on the first day of our discussion of this Mishnah 2 days ago, that you are exempt from liability for violating Shabbos, violating the Torah prohibition of carrying or now throwing on Shabbos, if you throw from a private domain to another private domain across the street. So the example is 2 balconies, one on either side of the street. And if you throw an object from one balcony to the other across the street, it passes through the public domain. This is prohibited by rabbinic decree, but one is exempt from liability to bring a sin offering because you did not violate a Torah prohibition when you do this. If the 2 balconies are on the same side of the street and you throw an object from one balcony to the other, still you violated a rabbinic prohibition, but you are exempt from liability to bring the sin offering because you did not violate a Torah prohibition, going private domain to private domain on the same side of the street if you threw it. Here's the odd thing. If you pass the object, right, the balconies are pretty close together. I can take an object and just sort of reach out, and my neighbor on his balcony is going to receive it if I pass it to him. So then we are liable. Both of us are liable to bring the sin offering because we violated Shabbos. Why is this special situation carved out from the exemption that is received for throwing the object either across the street or from one balcony to another on the same side of the street? But if we pass it, we are liable. And we learn this out from the activity of the Levites in the wilderness, who would pack up and unpack the tabernacle, right? So when the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, sometimes known as the tent of meeting, but that center edifice, a tent, it was portable, but this was, the center of holiness in the center of the camp of the children of Israel. It's in the center of the Levite camp, which is in the center of the beautiful array of the whole Jewish people in the wilderness. 2 million people out there in the wilderness, 3 tribes in the north, 3 tribes in the east, 3 tribes in the south, 3 tribes in the west. And in the midst, the Levite camp with the families of the Levites, 1 in the north, 1 in the west, 1 in the south, and Moses and Aaron and their immediate family to the east of the tabernacle. And in the midst of that whole array would stand the tabernacle. What does it mean that the Levites would pass in a way that we're going to make sure not to do that on Shabbos, since then, later in our time? Because we learn all of the prohibited labors were the labors that were necessary to build, to construct in the first place, or to put together the Mishkan in subsequent, it was built once, it was created once, but then they would take it down and put it up every time the encampment moved to a new place. And in fact, in this week's Torah portion, we learned for the first time, the array was given, the Mishkan was built, they put it up, the cloud of glory rested on it, and then in this week's Torah portion, for the first time, the people set out, right? They packed up the Mishkan, and then they set out according to the order that God told Moses to tell the people, this is how you will march. These tribes will go first, then these tribes, then the Levites with the wagons, in the midst of it, the family, the Levitical family of Kehas, who would actually carry the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, and the other holy vessels. They would not go in a wagon. The members of the Kehas family would carry it on their shoulders. Then more wagons, and then the rear vanguard of the other 6 tribes coming up behind. And this would be the order that the whole children of Israel, 2 million people, would move from one location to the next in the desert. So when the Levites would strike camp, right, when they would bring down the Mishkan, take apart the tabernacle, and get it ready for travel, what would they do? They would load up the wagons, right? So the vessels, the Ark of the Covenant and the holy vessels used in the tabernacle, those were carried by hands. But the tent itself, I mean, you can imagine, if you've ever been to a circus in a tent, like you can imagine that huge tent and like all of the beams and ropes and hooks and the acres, like pretty much, not acres, but the many thousands of square yards of fabric used to cover it. All of that would have to get packed up, put on wagons, and they would move it to the next location. So here we're talking specifically about the beams. So if you ever read the description in the Torah of the beams that were necessary to construct this tabernacle, they were made of acacia wood, and they were large. They were large beams. There's some discrepancy exactly about how big and the extensions on them, etc. But I'm pretty sure they were 10 cubits high, and some say more. And that's pretty big, right? So the wagons were not so huge. So a lot of these beams, and I think maybe the thing went across maybe they're 15 cubits high. I don't have the number in front of me right this second, but they were large, okay? And so these beams would lie across not just one wagon, but two wagons. So it actually took two wagons going side by side with the beams resting across them. You know, if you've ever been on the highway or the freeway, when you see sometimes they're bringing huge cement beams that hold up skyscrapers and parking lots and things like that. And sometimes, you know, it's like it's not a regular truck that can carry such a beam. It takes like sort of like a truck and a trailer, and you know, there's the accompanying car in front and behind with the yellow lights to warn everybody that it's a wide and long load, right? So these beams were a wide load, and they went across two wagons. So when they would load onto the wagons, it would be passed through the first wagon and over to the second wagon. And so these wagons were considered like each wagon is a private domain, and the beam gets passed across the space in between the two wagons. And so now you see where we learn out that on Shabbos we're not going to do what the Levites were doing in the wilderness on the weekdays, which is to pass an object from one private domain that's off the ground, like the wagon is off the ground, to another private domain that is off the ground, like these balconies on the same side of the sidewalk, and in between them is the ground, right? So it's being passed across a public domain space between the two private domains. And this is where we learn out this rule that since the Levites passed in the wilderness on weekdays, and they wouldn't do that on Shabbos, we don't do that on Shabbos either. There's a question that comes up, well, we also have a teaching that if a public domain is covered, then it's not a full-fledged public domain. So it's like if you're ever, you know, you're at a reception, it's like in a public place, but they've erected a tent to keep the sun off everybody. There's no walls, but there's a cover. So underneath that cover, you can carry. You don't have to worry about carrying your plate from the buffet table over to, you know, your table where you're sitting, because that's no longer considered carrying in the public domain. So some will say, well, when the beams go from one wagon to the other, the space in between them is covered by the beams. And there's two answers to that challenge. One is the answer of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that the beams were not square all the way up. They're vertical beams, right? And that there's a setup, a structure of vertical beams all around that are going to hold up the Mishkan, going to hold up the tabernacle. These beams are a cubit by a cubit at the bottom, right? So about 1.5 by 1.5 feet. These are heavyweight wooden beams, right? 1.5 by 1.5 beam. If you've ever done any construction, like, you know, 6 by 6 is a heavy beam. 12 by 12 is a very heavy beam. These are like 18 inches by 18 inches. They're solid, heavy beams. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, they were square at the bottom, and then they tapered as they went up to the top. And at the top, they were only as wide as a finger breadth. So when these beams would slide across from one wagon to the next, there would be quite a gap between them, and so they wouldn't combine to cover the ground beneath them. And so according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no issue that the public domain beneath them is not a public domain because it's covered, because in fact the beams don't combine to cover that area. A different challenge that's not written in this daf might be something like, well, that area was public until the beams slid across. Then maybe it becomes covered, but it wasn't covered until the beam went across. But that's not here in our daf, so that's just my speculation. Okay, so that's where we get the law against you can't pass you can throw an object from private domain to a private domain over a public domain, but you can't pass such an object. And this only applies if they're on the same side of the street. If they're on opposite side of the streets, you could even I mean, I think you just won't be able to, but it won't apply. You could throw or you could pass, right? You're still going to violate a rabbinic decree, but you wouldn't be liable for the sin offering. Okay, now let's get to the women who sewed the fabrics, who created the fabrics that were used to cover the tabernacle, the curtains and the cover. Now, the upper cover was made out of tachash skins and ram skins. Okay, so the upper cover was made out of this animal, the tachash, that doesn't exist anymore, may not have even still been around at the time that they were coming out of the desert. It might have already become extinct, but they had the hides, or it became extinct shortly thereafter. Then there's another layer, which is the ram skins. That's the very top. But once you get below the skins, you have these curtains that cover the sides of the tabernacle. And there are two levels or two layers. I think it's two levels. There's the upper curtain and the lower curtain. The lower curtains, which is what you see at ground level, right, when you walk up to the Mishkan, this is what everybody would experience as they walked around, is the main thing that they would see. Beautiful, beautiful curtains. They were made out of thread that was scarlet, purple, and techelis, a sky blue. So blue, purple, and scarlet, woven in very, very beautiful, beautiful patterns. And of those curtains, it says that every wise-hearted woman spun with her hands, and they brought that which they had spun, the blue, the purple, the scarlet, and the linen. So, and perhaps linen here is also being used as a color, and so it was blue, purple, and scarlet, and then there was the thread that was undyed, and together with those four colors, I mean, just beautiful, elaborate patterns, and they were created by every wise-hearted woman who spun with her hands. The upper curtains were much less spectacular, much less beautiful. They were made out of goat's hair, which is considered to be inferior and common. It's like the poor people would have clothing made out of goat's hair. The rich people would have linen, clothing made out of, a much finer and colored linen. And I guess the very richest people could have even softer fabrics as their clothing. But about the more common seeming upper curtains, which were made out of goat's hair, it says that the women who made the goat's hair curtains, about them it says, and all the women whose hearts inspired them with wisdom spun the goat's hair, presumably. So our sages comment on this. Our sages taught that the wisdom that was stated with regard to the top curtains was greater than that which was stated with regard to the bottom ones. Why? Why is the wisdom necessary to create these upper curtains, which are much less impressive and made out of a material which is less fine, less luxurious, less beautiful, more common, an inferior fabric made from goat's hair? Why did it take greater wisdom on the part of the women who made the upper curtains than was required of the women who made the lower curtains? We have a hint in the specific words that are used to describe these two groups of women. And by the way, I don't think that the women themselves were separated. I think women could be functioning in either group depending on what they're doing. But when the particular people were making the lower curtains, it said of them, every wise-hearted woman who spun with her hands. And when women were working on the upper curtains, it says about them, all of the women whose hearts inspired them with wisdom spun the goats. So we find some, I think, fascinating differences here. First of all, the lower curtains, it talks about every woman who spun with her hands. So it's like the women were operating as individuals. They were part of a collective enterprise. They were all working on these same curtains, but each woman was working on her own using her wise heart. The women who were working on the upper curtains, of them it says, all of the women whose hearts inspired them with wisdom. Now, our sages are saying this is a higher level of wisdom. So perhaps one thing that's different is that they're working as a unified group. And that's going to be necessary because they're not just, making curtains to the best of their ability that are going to last and protect the tabernacle, but they're doing something that's quite unexpected. They're spinning the hair right off the goats, right? It's like the hair is coming directly off the goats and going into the spinning wheel and becoming the thread and then getting worked into these curtains. It's not like the goats are being shaved and the hairs are being gathered and then they're being turned into string. It's coming directly off the goats and into the spinning wheel. How did they do that? Why did they do that? It seems to me like there was something that needed to be just exactly right, because those lower curtains are going to be beautiful and they're going to make an impressive display. But those upper curtains are going to protect the lower curtains. They're going to protect the tabernacle. They're going to add an extra measure of protection from the elements, from the rain, from the sun. And they had to be made very well, very carefully, because even though they wouldn't be so noticeable, right? The lower curtains are going to get all the attention, all the glamour. But if the upper curtains broke down, then it would be a problem, and then people would notice, and then how are we going to fix it, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to get back to that stage, that state of tremendous elevated wisdom that we had when we made them. So they really had to function at this higher level. They had to function in concert. They had to work together to make this happen. And then I would add, it seems to me that the difference between somebody who is wise-hearted and somebody whose heart inspires them with wisdom, I believe the difference is wise-hearted means you have the skill. Right? These are people who were skilled craftswomen. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to make something beautiful because they had experience making beautiful things. And so they brought to bear all of the knowledge and expertise that they had, and they gave with their full heart to make these curtains as absolutely beautiful as they could. They applied the knowledge they had with all their heart. But when they were working on the upper curtain, they were doing something that hadn't been done before. Lower curtains hadn't been made before either. I mean, the tabernacle had not existed before. But maybe those women had already, even in Egypt, that their trade was needlecraft and linen weaving. And they had, they hadn't made these textiles, they had made these fabrics, but they had made something similar. They had those skills. When it came time to produce those upper curtains, they were doing something that hadn't been done before. There was a need. God told them the tabernacle has to be made this way. He communicated it to Moses. Moses communicated it to Bezalel, who was the sort of, the artist and architect in charge directly of designing and building the Mishkan. And he communicated to these women, okay, this is what we need. I don't know how we do it. Figure it out, because that's what we need. And so here the women applied everything that was in them to come up with a skill that didn't already exist. This is the difference between applying a skill that they have, the difference between that and having a vision, right? Seeing a need that's in the world and figuring out how to fill it. And that's why our sages are saying it's a higher level of wisdom. Now, as I said, it's not two different groups of women. I think it's women working, on two different projects. And when they were working on those upper curtains, which were going to get a lot less attention in the end, no one's going to notice those upper curtains made out of goat's hair. But they required more skill and imagination and vision to make them work. And I think in our own lives, we need to be able to distinguish which situation we're in. Sometimes we face a problem and we say, well, okay, I've seen similar things, and I'm gonna apply all my focus and attention and experience to solve this problem in ways that have worked before, right? So I've got my tools, I've got my tool belt, I've got my experience. and let me see if I can apply solutions that I've seen work elsewhere in here, in this situation. And there's other times when we face problems and we say, you know what? What's worked in other places and other times, it's not going to work here. I need to study exactly what is needed, what's needed today, and what's going to be needed in the future from here. I have to craft a lasting solution in a novel situation. And here you need your heart to inspire you. Your heart is going to identify the need. And now you're going to say, when you speak to your heart, it's like you're speaking with your soul. What you're saying is you're connecting to God. You're connecting to the source of all our soul and saying, please inspire me. I need your help. I'm looking for a solution for this that's going to have a lasting impact and help people. Please inspire me to find a solution that hasn't existed before, right? So sometimes we apply all the skill and experience we've got. Sometimes we have to pray for inspiration and for help to come up with a novel solution to a problem. And I think that the women who built the tabernacle were able to function in both ways. And, after it was all done and everyone was going, wow, at those beautiful lower curtains and the colors, the people who worked on it, they knew, right? They knew that those are beautiful, but it's those upper curtains that no one is noticing that are really holding this structure together. And I think it's a nice tribute that we can pay to all the unsung heroes that keep our society going, to at the very least notice, right? Notice the systems that are keeping our society together, who's behind them, what work are they doing, and if we have the opportunity to thank them, to do it. I think, we're all a lot closer to that now that we've seen systems in our society, in the pandemic and then the demonstrations and the rioting and looting and everything. We've seen so many systems break down that when things are operating normally, could take a moment and say, wow, this is amazing, right? This system is working. The plumbing in this building, it's working. The elevators are working. I personally, every time I notice that, the unseen engineers in our society have fixed a problem and something works better, an elevator has been improved, an escalator has been improved, traffic lights have been improved. I notice those things. I think it's important for all of us to notice those things, that unseen work, that if they do a good job, no one even notices. If it breaks down, then we notice, right? And then we complain about it. So if we're going to complain about broken systems in our society, then let's remember to thank people and acknowledge when the systems are working well. All right, let me check if there are comments or questions that I can address. Joyce Noach said, what kind of object is one throwing from balcony to balcony? Joyce, great question. I don't know. Maybe a challah. Maybe one neighbor says, hey, do you have an extra challah? We just had a bunch of guests come in. That kind of an object. It's not defined in these passages. What we do know about that one exception where it's not only permitted, you're not violating a Torah obligation, but you wouldn't even be violating a rabbinic obligation, is that you could throw from one balcony across the street to another balcony where one person owns both balconies, right? But even in that case, it only applies if you're throwing something fragile, not a challah. Because a challah, if you dropped it, you probably run down and go get the challah. But if you dropped an egg, okay, so it broke, you're not going to go down and get it. And it actually has to be fragile in order to qualify for that permit, because the sages don't want you to go running down, and sort of, interfere with your enjoyment of Shabbos to go fetch something from the street that was dropped from your balcony and then carry it back upstairs. That's the issue, right? If it drops in the public domain and you pick it up and bring it in, then you've carried in. That's the issue that they don't want you to get involved in. Brian of Bloomfield says, by upper curtains, we're talking about the protective layer that covered the entire structure. I don't think so. I think the protective layer that covered the entire structure was made out of hides. Those are the tachash skins and the ram's skins. Here we're talking about the wool curtains above the multicolored curtains. And the way the Daf says it, the Daf says the bottom curtains in the tabernacle were made of sky blue wool and purple wool and scarlet wool and of fine linen, and the top curtains were made of goat hair, even though that material is considered to be inferior and common. So so there it is. It wasn't just color. The scarlet and purple and blue, that's made out of wool, so that's sheep's hair, right? And linen as well. And right away we say, whoa. I thought we never mix wool and linen in our clothing, and we don't. But here in the tabernacle, because it was ordered by God to be done that way, so okay, in the tabernacle we do what God says. And even in the priests, the Kohen's garments, there was this forbidden mixture of shatnez. It's just that one exception that proves the rule. The Kohens could do that because God said in that case you do it. Everyone else, you don't do that. So it's lower curtains and upper curtains, not the cover of the whole curtain. And Doc Wool says maybe it's more to do with a wise heart being simply wise, but an inspired heart could cultivate a range of good qualities. I really like that, Doc. That's good. I think that wisdom, I think, is something to really be prized and nurtured and developed. Knowledge is just something we gather. The more we learn, the more we remember, the better we are at retaining things that we've learned, information, as it were, the more knowledge we have. And knowledge is a very good thing. And the more of it we have, the more we have to draw from as we're trying to make wise decisions, right? Wisdom comes from applying knowledge, applying the lessons of experience, finding a path through, the sort of challenging and conflicting needs of our society. So maybe wisdom is a little higher than knowledge, but there's still a kind of wisdom that we already have, right? And I think when our hearts inspire us with wisdom, now we're saying, well, now we need more wisdom than we already have. We don't know how to handle the problem before us, and we need help doing that. And I can really tell you that, every time I face, as a writer, right, if I'm facing pages that I need to write today, whether it's a screenplay or a book, and I'm afraid. I just don't want to sit down in my seat and start writing because I don't know what I'm going to write, and I feel like I'm dried up and I don't have a solution. And if I just pray at that moment, say, please, God, I need your help. Help me to, first of all, make sure I'm doing this for the right reason. Help me to find something new to say, something correct to say, something that will inspire others. Then a peace comes over me. And then solutions come. And I think that there we're getting into, the heart inspiring with wisdom beyond the wisdom we already possess. That's what I've got for us today. I'm wishing you all such a sweet, meaningful, healthy, Torah and joy-drenched Shabbos, wherever you may be. Sending you all lots of love from LA. Take care, my holy